Yeah, we're going to be talking about the next part of the Buddha's life. That's the story, that's the sort of series we're going through. But like in a TV series, you know, sometimes it starts and it's like different characters and stuff and different people, and you're like, what's going on? Am I watching the right series? And it's like a flashback, and you're like, I see what they did there. It's a flashback. That's what we're going to start with, except it's a flash forward. So I'm going to start with a story from the Buddha's life. And so this is after he's gained enlightenment. So sorry for the spoiler if you're waiting for that bit. But it's after he's gained enlightenment. It's a story about a man called Bahia. So Bahia is a spiritual practitioner. He's a very good man, and he's trying to lead, sort of follow that noble quest that Abhayanandi was talking about. He's a spiritual teacher, and actually he has a level of attainment. He's quite sort of spiritually gifted in certain ways, and he has a certain amount of fame as well, and he sort of has a following. And one of his sort of gifts is he sort of has a bit of sort of psychic. He sort of has some psychic abilities, and he has this sort of intuition, this sort of feeling that his death is coming, and that his death is not so far away. He sort of suddenly feels into sort of mortality and a feeling that he might be dying soon. And so he has this thought to himself that, I wonder if I've become an arahant. In my life practicing, I wonder if I've become enlightened. Yeah, I wonder if I am one of those enlightened practitioners. And then Bahia has a visitation. So a deva, which is a bit like, it's like a sort of like the Buddhist angels, right? So the deva comes down, and the deva is actually an old relative of Bahia's who's passed away in deva form. And the deva comes to Bahia, who's having this thought, questioning whether he's become enlightened. And he says, Bahia, you're not enlightened. You've not become an arahant. And in fact, Bahia, you're not even on the path. You're not even on the right track. Yeah. You think you're on the right track. You think you're on this noble quest, but actually you've got it wrong. And Bahia is shocked because it's sort of like the way he's been living his life suddenly doesn't hold up or something. He hasn't been living it the way he thinks he's been, or intending to live it. And the deva says to him, but Bahia, there is someone who is enlightened. There is someone who's trod the path you're trying to tread. And he's called the Buddha, and he's staying not far from you. Yeah. So he tells the Buddha, tells Bahia where the Buddha is staying. And so Bahia, sort of realizing the sort of urgency that he's got this feeling that the time of his death might be soon. And he has this urgency to get back onto this sort of noble quest, noble path. He goes and walks to meet the Buddha. It's medieval India. He can't get the train. He walks. And he walks, and he keeps on walking. He walks for days and days. In fact, he walks for 3 weeks and only stopping to sleep and eat. Yeah? So the deva said it was quite close, and after week 2, I'd be like, hey, you said it was close. But maybe 3 weeks walk is not that long in ancient India. And finally he reaches where the Buddha is staying, and he sees a group of monks. So he asks the monks, I'm here, I've come all this way, I'm looking for this enlightened teacher, I'm looking for the Buddha. And they said, well, the Buddha's out in the town at the moment. He's just gone on his alms round. Alms round is where the monks would go around and sort of beg for their food. That's how they would get their meal. So the Buddha is out on his alms round, and Bahia goes into town. He's got this urgency, he can't wait. He goes to see the Buddha, and he finds him, and he falls at his knees, and he says, please, I've come all this way. Will you teach me the Dharma? Will you give me your teachings? And the Buddha just says to him, not right now, Bahia. Yeah, we've just started our alms round. It's not the right time. But Bahia has this urgency. he has this intuition that the time of his death might be soon. He says, look, I don't know how long I'm going to live for. Please, will you teach me the Dharma? And the Buddha again says, look, not right now, Bahya. Come again later on once we finish the alms round. And the third time, he says, look, I feel an urgency here. I'm not sure when the time of my death is going to be. Please, will you teach me Dharma? I've come all this way. And he says, and so there's a tradition that, traditionally in the scriptures, whenever the Buddha is asked something 3 times, he would give a response. And so he gives a response. He says, very well then, Bahya, this is how you must practice. In the seen, there is only the seen. In the heard, there is only the heard. In the imagined, there is only the imagined. And in the cognized, there is only the cognized. And on the spot, Bahya, who's walked all this way and is so receptive and open, gets this teaching. He's so open and receptive, it goes right in, and on the spot he gains enlightenment. And actually, after that, later on that day, Bahya does die. He does pass away. So that's the story of Bahya. And so I was thinking of Bahya quite a lot recently. I've been reflecting on the story of Bahya, and also just thinking that Bahya is a good man. He has really best intentions. He thinks what he's doing is he thinks he's on the noble path. And it's interesting, Buddhism doesn't we're in the sort of path of transformation, but it doesn't say we start off as sort of evil or something or inherently bad. It just says that we're not quite seeing it right. It's like we're mistaken. We're not quite seeing things how things quite are, and that's what causes us pain. And that's what's happened with Bahya. He thinks he's on the noble path, he has all these good intentions, but he's just been interpreting his experience slightly wrong. He's not quite seeing his things how they are. And that's what we do, yeah? So we're just like Bahya in the story. Sometimes I listen to these stories and I kind of think, oh God, I know so many people like that. But we're the ones. It's like us. We're the unenlightened ones in the story. It's like, yeah. But that's what we do. We misinterpret our experience. That's the situation we're in. So when we look at our experience, it's kind of like, you look at it, we've been sitting in meditation and looking at our experience. When we look at our experience, it's sort of like there's something happening in here, roughly around here, something happening in there, and then there's something happening out there, yeah? And so that becomes our basis. We sort of think, okay, the stuff that's happening in here, that's me. Experience happening here, that's me. And the stuff happening out there that I can see and feel, that's sort of the world. And we sort of think of ourselves as fixed. Like, if I think back to, in the past and things, I can't just think about, I've always been me, traversing this world of other things, which I'm kind of separate from. Yeah? Sort of like I'm traversing this world which is separate and also fixed and also unchanging. So it's got this sort of fixed self and this fixed sort of world around us. Now on an intellectual level, we kind of know that's not true. We kind of sort of know, I know that my emotions are never fixed for a moment. I know my thoughts aren't fixed. Actually, there's no cell in my body that's fixed and unchanging. I'm always in this process of sort of flow and change. And likewise with the world around me and around us. But we live, sort of on an emotional level, we live as if that's the case. Yeah? On a sort of unconscious level, we live like that's the case. And we don't tend to look at it. And it gets us by, it roughly gets us by, but we don't tend to look at it. And because it's not quite how things are, it causes us pain. Yeah? But like what Brian and Andy, it's what I was saying last night, it causes us pain because we bump up against reality. The way we're seeing things, our sort of default factory setting, is not quite in line with how things actually are. Yeah? So what that gets us to do, what Abhay and Andy was saying, was gets us into craving. Yeah? It gets us into craving and aversion. This is me, and this is the world. And so the way we operate is to get things that we like, sort of grasp for things that give us pleasure, and just push away things that are painful and that we don't want. The Buddhist path isn't against pleasure. In fact, the path is a path of greater and greater pleasure. But the problem is that sort of craving, that sort of grasping after things we want, becomes neurotic. Yeah? And we start loading things with a level of meaning and value which they just can't give us. Yeah? So we do this with material things. Yeah? We do this with like career or fame or romantic partners. We sort of project onto the object of our craving this level of satisfaction and meaning that it just isn't capable of giving us. So I do this with clothes. I do with a lot of things, but this was the most okay one I was sharing. You know, I do it with clothes. Do it with all of them. We'd all do it with all of them. But so I do this thing. I've got rid of it now, but I had an app called Vinted. Very dangerous app to have, particularly at 11 o'clock at night, and your willpower's a bit dodgy and your judgment's not so good. But I buy a new shirt, for instance, and it's like, okay, it's arriving in 5 days. I'm like, 5 days? But that shirt is like, I'm going to look so good in that shirt. Like, I've got to wait 5 days. And suddenly, my whole wardrobe is full of dull shirts. Yeah? And I'm like, oh, I can't possibly go out in one of these. Yeah? And I've got to wait 5 days until I can finally get the shirt, which is... And then, you get the shirt, and then after you get it, you're like, yes, yes, yes. 2 days later, it's just in the wardrobe with the other shirts. Yeah? So sort of layer it with this sort of level of value that it's going to give you, which it can't give. And Abhay and Andy was saying that we sort of, getting these things we want, it's like we're trying to build a sort of comfort palace for ourselves. But Abhay and Andy was saying actually the palace is more like a prison. We think we're building we think this is the way to go about happiness, but actually we're building a prison. And what happens is we get attached to the objects of our craving. Yeah, and that happens. But what that looks like is when the thought of not being with that object of craving. So the thought of not being with that partner becomes unbearable. Yeah, it's like you don't even want to bear thinking about not having that partner, not having that career. So, and we can feel sort of attached to these things, like woven into them, like we need them in our life, far longer after they're giving us anything positive. Yeah. When I came across the Dharma, I was in a long-term relationship, and was, lovely person, but together the relationship was not good. Yeah. But I couldn't bear the thought of ending it. Perhaps people can, think about something like that in their life. But the thought of ending it was just sort of unbearable. And I could see from a certain perspective, like I could sort of get this objective perspective. I remember sitting down it was actually with my mum at one point. We don't normally have deep conversations, but I was with my mum, and I just remember saying, I think I'm deeply unhappy about 3/4 of the time. And I could see it objectively, and she was just saying that is an awful lot of the time. But I couldn't, the thought of losing that thing that I was attached to, that relationship, still was so difficult to pull away from. We also get, another thing we get attached to is sort of identities that we sort of give ourselves, or not give ourselves, but we're always sort of trying to build up sort of an identity, a sort of sense of self, a sense of me. And we're always doing that, but the problem is the identities are limiting. Yeah, we sort of build something, we get attached to it, but soon enough that identity doesn't serve us. I used to have this identity. I was saying this. I shared this in meditation this morning in the other room. I used to have this identity, which I retrospectively call the tortured artist. When I was at music college, and sort of the tortured artist would sort of, be walking back from the jazz club 1 a.m. in the rain, sort of feeling pensive, sort of a feeling of no one will ever understand my art. Like no one will ever really understand me and my art. And it wasn't a great identity to have for myself. No one will ever understand me and my art. It's not a great way to make connections with people. But somehow, interestingly enough, like I was on the, beyond the night bus, 2 a.m., feeling all down. And it's like somehow I was like, oh, that's me. There's some sort of comfort in the familiar or something. I got some comfort, even though it wasn't really serving me. Yeah. So we sort of, these things that we get attached to and build our sort of palace around, they can become our whole perspective. Like our career can become the only thing that we can think about and see. It becomes really important to us. And often it has to take a sort of tragedy, some sort of tragedy, to actually cut through it and for a bigger perspective to come through. So I have a friend, and she owns a shop, and she's like, it's her own shop she'd made, like all off her own back. And she's sort of, whenever we talk, it's all about how's the shop doing, who's working in the shop now. It's like her own business, and it's kind of like her and the shop are kind of the same thing in a way. Like that is her. Earlier in the year, her mother, who lives on the other side of the world, was dying, and my friend, and she was really, really close with her mother, and my friend, it looked like she might not be able to go and see her mother and visit her because of all her ties and commitments that she had with the shop. And I can remember sitting with her, and she was just talking me through this and thinking that she might not even be able to get back to see her. And she was sat there in the shop, which we normally just talk about all the time, and she sat there and said, all of this is meaningless. All of this is meaningless. So in the light of death, in the light of the coming death of her mother, the sort of palace she'd built for herself, or the world she'd built for herself, suddenly the light of death sort of, when it shines on it, can sort of show its superficiality. When reality comes sort of through in our lives, it can sort of shine this light on how we're living and sort of what's actually most important and meaningful to us. So I just want to share another story. At the start of the year, my grandmother passed away, and it was a very painful time, and in a certain sense, seeing her on her deathbed was very painful. But in another way, it was a very beautiful time. And it's like when at a time of loss, it could be the end of a relationship, the end of a career, or a loved one passing away. It sort of opens up a window, and you suddenly start to feel more in touch with something meaningful. There's a window around the time of my grandmother's death where I can really recollect all the things that happened. I can really recollect conversations I had with my dad, because we were suddenly talking on a much more real level. I can really remember the sky. Like I can really remember the sky just seemed really loud at the funeral. Like the sky just seemed incredibly loud. And there's a certain aliveness that comes through when the light of sort of reality cuts through our day-to-day life. Yeah, but of course it closes up again. Yeah, and a week later I'm just back in the routine of life, back on the phone. Yeah. And this is what happens to Bahir. Yeah. So this is what happened to Bahir. In the light of death, he suddenly, how he was living his life came under sort of introspection and how he was living. And this is what's happened to the Buddha. And this is where we left the Buddha last night. Yeah. He's really seen on a deep level his own mortality and the mortality of those he loves. Yeah, he's seen it on a really deep level, and it's thrown into question whether his life, the life he's living, is actually in line with what he finds most meaningful, and the sort of superficiality of it has sort of shown itself. But of course, the Buddha sees this fourth sight. Yeah, so he sees death, he sees old age, sickness, and death, and he sees this fourth sight. He sees someone sort of walking with, sort of embodying sort of contentment, calm, and sort of walking with a majesty which is different to his own. And the fourth sight really resonates with him. There's a sort of familiarity. He sort of sees it, and it's sort of something a bit that you can't quite put into words, resonates with him, and it has an effect on him. And often the Dharma, I find, has this effect when we first hear it. So, I can remember a fourth sight for me, I think, was coming to the Buddhist Center for the first time and hearing my first Dharma talk. And it had both the effect of feeling completely profound and incredibly familiar. Like someone was saying, or just articulating in words, putting into words how I'd been feeling. But I just couldn't have put it into words, how I was feeling on a deep level. And 8 years later, that person who I heard ended up ordaining me, so be careful. But there's a sort of resonance with the Buddha, seeing this fourth sight. It's very familiar to him. And at the Buddha's birth, so this is now we're doing one of those flashbacks, so flashback in the series. At the Buddha's birth, it was sort of prophesized that he would either become a great warrior and a great sort of leader, or a great spiritual practitioner and spiritual leader. That was the prophecy. He would either become the warrior or the holy man. And his father, who was this great sort of leader of this warrior clan, of course, didn't want him to become a holy man, wanted him to become a leader. And so that's why he sort of puts him in this palace, makes sure he just sees and gets attached to the pleasures of the palace. So he doesn't sort of, there isn't any chance of him going down the other route. But it's like the seeds of that, the seeds of his potential as a spiritual practitioner are still in him. Yeah? Underneath the layers of conditioning that are put on top of him, it's like there's still something, the seeds of that, sort of the potential for him to grow into that spiritual leader is still there. And so when he sees that fourth sight, it's like that awakens in him. It resonates with him. It feels familiar. Yeah? And that's the same for us. That's why I think lots of people have this experience of the Dharma feeling incredibly familiar, or a sort of responsiveness to it, a sort of intuitive responsiveness to something a bit more real. The seeds of enlightenment are also within us. In fact, it's our birthright. Yeah. So the Buddha is deeply disillusioned with the palace life, and he's seen this sight, and he's got some sort of feeling, a natural responsiveness to it. And that's the only sort of hope he's got. So he feels the only thing he can do is leave. So he goes forth from the palace. He decides to leave it all behind, get out of the palace life, get out of his role as a sort of ruler or as a prince. And he decides to go forth and just in quest of sort of following that feeling, following that sense of something more real. So he decides to sort of escape in the dead of night, to go unnoticed. And so he readies his chariot one last time, but he fears that when he leaves, he's going to wake up the guards, and he's not going to be able to get out. So that night, as he's leaving, something sort of magical happens, and a deep sleep falls over the guards in the palace. And as he rides out on his chariot across the cobbled palace courtyard, these devas that visited Bahia, these devas come in and they muffle the hoofbeats, and they just fly along and they muffle the sound of the hooves so that they don't wake the guards. So these devas represent something sort of quite significant, and they appear at lots of different times in the Buddha's life. And it's like when we have that responsiveness, what they represent is when we have that responsiveness, sort of natural responsiveness to something greater than us, really, something bigger than us. And if we make a step towards it, like the Buddha's done, gone forth and makes a step towards it, it's like something of that that sort of, sort of spiritual reality or something that we're taking a step towards. It's like something of that takes a step towards us. It's sort of like it's a bit, you could feel it like some sort of energy or some sort of presence. And when you take a step towards it, sort of commit, to this feeling, it's like something comes to meet you. And if we keep going forth, if we keep taking steps towards that sort of feeling of something bigger than us, that sort of natural responsiveness to truth, if we keep taking steps towards that, it's like those devas that that energy, that sort of spiritual presence, will keep taking more steps towards us as well. And eventually, they sort of become the driving force, the main driving force in our lives, and in our practice. So the Buddha leaves the palace, and he goes forth, sort of into the unknown. And I think Bhante Sangharakshita has a saying that whenever you make a commitment, it's always a commitment to the unknown. And he steps into the unknown, and he swaps his princely robes with the robes of a beggar, and he shaves off his hair. And he goes forth in quest of, he looks for a teacher. He looks for someone to teach him and to find what it was, that sort of feeling of reality or something. He goes in quest of that, sort of stepping into the unknown. And that sort of shaving of the head and changing his robes, it's just a sign of his commitment. He really commits to this path. He goes away. He completely goes away, goes forth from the previous life he had or the way he was living, realizing it's not really in line with how things are, and goes forth in quest of the noble quest. And Bahia fully commits to that as well. And the Buddha fully commits to that. And the degree to which we really commit to that and sort of take a step into the unknown and keep testing ourselves. I mean, even coming on retreat, we were talking in our group earlier, coming onto retreat for the first time, you're stepping into the unknown. You don't really know what's going to happen on a retreat. It's really hard to describe what happens on a retreat. But we've all taken a step into the unknown, following an intuition of something bigger than ourselves and more than our day-to-day lives. And if we keep committing like that, keep going forth, the degree to which we do that, the degree that sort of bigger reality, that sort of more spiritual reality will open up to us. So the question I think that Bahia and the Buddha sort of had, or was left with, was, does the life I'm leading hold up in the light of death or in the light of reality? When that opens up, does the life I'm leading really hold up to that? Am I living from what is most meaningful to me? And that's the question that we have to keep asking ourselves as we practice and keep going forth towards. Does the life I'm leading holding up in the light of death? So, just going to finish with a poem. It's a quite famous poem, so you might have heard it. But I think it sort of captures something of that. So you might want to maybe just close your eyes and I'll just read through the poem. It's called The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveller. Long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other, as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that the passing there had wore them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference.